This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and today is Monday, and that means it's time for the 532nd MTG Top 10. In this series, I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. Tonight will also be the second night of Hanukkah, and for that reason, I wanted to do a festive video. So that's what we're doing, with a look at cards with a mana value of 8. You may be wondering how the number 8 has anything to do with Hanukkah, so let me dust off my history PhD and explain why the number 8 matters for this holiday. You may know that there are 8 nights of Hanukkah, so let me explain why. In 168 BCE, Jerusalem was under the control of the Seleucids, a Greek empire that descended from the conquests of Alexander the Great. That year, the king, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, began to persecute Jews, wanting them to be more acculturated and give up their Jewish culture in favor of Greek culture. With a few exceptions, Jews had been allowed to practice their religion even under the rule of a variety of people who came before the Seleucids. So this was a pretty big shock. Things got even worse when Antiochus decided to transform the Jewish temple, the center of Jewish monotheistic religion, into a pagan shrine. This led to an uprising commonly called the Maccabean Revolt, and by 161 BCE, the Seleucids had been pushed out of Jerusalem, and the desecrated temple was rededicated to God. Among a number of issues with the building in the wake of a war was the fact that the candelabra that was supposed to contain a flame that was always lit had been extinguished. The candelabra was relit after the temple was retaken, but there was only enough oil for maybe one day, and it would have been at least a week before they could get any additional oil. They decided to relight the candelabra anyway, and miraculously, this meager amount of oil was enough to keep the candelabra lit for 8 days. And that's where the number 8 comes in here, as a result of this miracle with the oil during the rededication of the temple. And in fact, Hanukkah means dedication. In celebration of these events, Jews light a candle every night of Hanukkah on a special 8-branched candelabra, called a menorah or a Chanukiah. So that's why the number 8 is important for Hanukkah, and that's why this MTG Top 10 looks at cards with a mana value of 8. This isn't actually the first time I've done this. During Hanukkah 2018, I did the same list, but that was so long ago that what we call mana value now was still called converted mana cost. So this list is actually an update of that one. So as usual, in addition to discussing the current MTG Top 10, I'll also discuss the cards that have fallen off the list since the last one. Obviously, 8 mana is a massive investment, one you expect to get a big return on, so it should come as no surprise that some of the most powerful cards in the game are on this list. Of course, as we'll see, people don't actually pay 8 mana for most of the cards on this list very often. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points. This includes events like Pro Tours and World Championships, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like Grand Prix and Magic Fests. One thing to note here is that back in 2018, I actually did an MTG Top 8 to be extra festive. This time I decided to do a full-blown MTG Top 10 so we can talk about more cards, but as a result of that shorter list last time, there are actually only 2 cards that were on it in 2018 that are no longer on it today. So let's start with a look at those 2 cards. The first of those is Chroma Angel of Wrath, who held the number 6 spot last time, but she hasn't gained a single point in a very long time. She's a 6/6 flyer with a suite of awesome keywords, including Vigilance, Flying, First Strike, Trample, Haste, and Protection from both black and red, and obviously that makes her a powerful creature, and for a time, she was even the most powerful creature around. Between 2003 and 2008, she was the premier creature to cheat into play with Ramp and Reanimation. However, there are a lot of better options these days, including some of the other cards we'll see on this list, and that's what's led to her stalling out since 2008. Elder Deep Fiend also fell off of the list after holding the number 7 slot last time. This Eldrazi Octopus is an 8 mana 5/6 with Flash that taps 4 permanents when it enters the battlefield. Importantly, it comes with Emerge, which lets you pay an alternate cost of 5 generic and 2 blue, plus sacrificing a creature, and the creature you sacrifice reduces the cost of emerging it. This leads to the card being very easy to cast, and the fact it has flash can be an absolute beating. Not only can you flash it in to ambush block something, you can also use it to tap down opposing lands, which sometimes just feels like you're time walking your opponent. This can be especially nasty because the decks that played it usually sacrifice something for value too. Since 2018, it has gained a couple of points in Pioneer, but it wasn't near enough to hold on to a spot on the new list, even with it expanded out to a top 10. Alright, let's move now to the new list. At number 10, it's Verdant Force. Back in 2018, it was at number 4, but it hasn't done anything since then, and really it hasn't done anything in any format for about 2 decades. This beefy creature has a powerful ability that makes you a sapperling on every upkeep. We don't see every upkeep that often, so it is easy to overlook, but it's important because it means that Verdant Force makes a sapperling even on your opponent's upkeep. That means that Verdant Force can quickly assemble an army for you, one that he will leave behind even if your opponent takes him down. Over the years, Verdant Force was mostly played in reanimation decks, as for a while, like Akroma, it was one of the best creatures around when looking at his power in a vacuum. Cheating it into play in the early game was nuts and not easy to deal with. It was reanimated in standard recurring survival decks and extended mono black reanimator. While it has received reprints recently that have made it legal in more formats, including standard again, the Force just doesn't measure up that well these days for an 8-mana creature. It managed to hang on to a spot on this list this time, but it seems likely it will slip off of this list if we revisit it again in 4 years. At number 9, it is Bedlam Reveler. While this has a mana value of 8, you can cast it for a lot less because it has its cost reduced for each instant and sorcery in your graveyard. The Reveler loves spells in general because it also happens to come with prowess, and on top of that, you get to reload your hand when it enters the battlefield. That goes really well with the rest of the card because you're probably casting lots of cheap spells to get the Reveler online. So the fact it gives you back a bunch of cards when you cast it is pretty great. Back in 2018, it only had 11 points, but it has seen some significant play in the interim. It saw a little bit of play in Standard, but Modern is where it's really taken off as it's been part of numerous spell-heavy decks in the format. This has included Prowess, Aggro, and Phoenix decks, and it's likely to keep gaining points in the future. At number 8, it is Sphinx of the Steel Wind. It didn't make the list last time, but it has seen a lot of play over the last 4 years, especially in Vintage. This massive 6/6 resembles a Chroma Angel of Wrath, and then it comes with a whole bunch of keywords, in this case, Flying, First Strike, Vigilance, Lifelink, and Protection from Red and Green, making it a pretty massive problem anytime it comes onto the battlefield. It can really stabilize any board in your favor, as it's hard to block, hard to attack through, hard to kill, and hard to race because it gains you so much life. The one downside is, of course, the 8 mana required to cast it, but it's gained all of its points in decks that look to get around that downside. It didn't see any play in Standard, but in the non-rotating formats there are plenty of ways to cheat the Sphinx into play early, something that is very hard for most opponents to recover from. In Modern, this involved reanimating it with Unburial Rites. In Legacy, it's put into play with reanimation spells, as well as Show and Tell and Tinker. And in Vintage, it can also be brought into play with Oath of Druids. It's done the most work by far in Vintage over the last 4 years, and that's likely to continue. It's simply one of the best things to cheat into play with Oath on turn 2 and Tinker on turn 3, especially because it's immune to so many removal spells in the format. At number 6, it is Archon of Cruelty, a card that didn't even exist back in 2018, but it's done enough over the last few years to come in at number 7. It was printed in 2021's Modern Horizons 2, which also means it isn't legal in formats like Standard and Pioneer. But it's so darn powerful that it's seeing play in all the formats it is legal in. This 8-mana 6/6 flyer comes with an incredibly punishing enter the battlefield and attack trigger, which drains your opponent 3 life, makes them sacrifice a creature, and forces them to discard a card. It has quickly become one of the premier creatures to cheat into play in multiple formats. In Modern, this is usually accomplished with indomitable creativity. In Legacy, it's often reanimated or put into play with Sneak Attack or Show and Tell, and in Vintage, it comes into play most often with Oath of Druids. If this comes down in the early game, it gives you absurd value, even if your opponent does find a way to deal with it. It is going to keep gaining points going forward. At number 6, it is Magma Opus. Like the Archon, this card didn't even exist in 2018. This powerful 8-mana instant was printed in 2021's Strixhaven. It has a massive effect on the board as it lets you divide 4 damage any way you want, taps 2 permanents, gives you a 4/4 token, and draws you 2 cards. Casting this is a great way to end a game in your favor, but you do need a bunch of mana to do it. However, it was pretty easy to cast in Standard, first thanks to the presence of a bunch of treasure and other ramp on powerful cards like Goldspan Dragon. Later, after the release of Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, it could be combined with Hinata the Dawn Crowned. Hinata reduces the cost of your spells by 1 for each target they have, and Magma Opus has a whole bunch of targets, so you can cast it at a massive discount. As in, usually the turn after you cast Hinata. The card was great when you cast it in the middle part of the game thanks to Treasure, and completely absurd alongside Hinata. In addition to finding a ton of success in Standard, the Opus has also found some success in Pioneer, Historic, and Alchemy. Magma Opus is going to keep on gaining points. At number 5, it is Sundering Titan, which held on to its number 5 spot on the list by gaining 21 points over the last 4 years. The Titan is an 8-mana 7/10 that destroys 1 land of each basic land type when it enters the battlefield. This makes it a pretty awesome thing to ramp into or otherwise cheat into play, since it can often cripple an opposing mana base while adding a very real threat to the board. It can end up blowing up your lands, of course, but most of the time, you can set up the Titan to do far more damage to your opponent. It's been played in Tron decks in both Extended and Modern, which can produce a bunch of mana with the Urza lands, and they also happen to run very few basic lands, or lands with the basic type in general, and can fully function even in their absence, so Sundering Titan doesn't usually do any collateral damage. It just comes down on turn 3 or 4 and nukes an opposing mana base. It performs a similar function in both Legacy and Vintage. In the former, Cloud Post is used in a similar manner to the Tron lands, and in the latter, Mishra's Workshop and other colorless lands that produce multiple mana are used alongside it. The Titan is going to keep gaining points in multiple formats. It's just so good at adding a massive threat to the board while also heavily disrupting the opponent. At number 4, it is Craterhoof Behemoth, which moved up 4 slots from the 2018 list. It accomplished this by gaining a whopping 45 points over the last 4 years. The Behemoth gives +X/+X in Trample to your whole board, where X is the number of creatures you control. This includes itself, and because it has haste, that definitely matters. This is a great way to win the game in any deck that can go really wide. Like the rest of the list, all of that does come at the steep price of 8 mana, so the decks that run it have to be capable of producing tons of mana or cheating it into play. The Behemoth is a great payoff for doing that stuff, so it has found its way to 58 points over the years. In Standard, Craterhoof Behemoth was played in Reanimator decks. In Modern, it gained its 1 point in a Simic Ramp deck, and in Legacy, where it's gained the most points, it's been played in Elf decks. Elves and the Behemoths combine really well together because so many of them make mana, and by the time you have enough in play to help you cast a Behemoth, the stats boost it offers will be more than enough to make your board lethal. Elf decks in Legacy have access to Glimpse of Nature, which makes all of this go down in a single turn in most cases, since it's entirely possible to just draw the whole library on a turn where you cast Glimpse. The Behemoth is going to keep gaining points in Legacy. Next, it's Gristlebrand, which held on to its number 3 slot on the list. While it may not sound like it had a great last 4 years because its rank didn't change, it has actually been pretty busy, gaining 41 points, so just to hold on to its spot on the list took a lot of work. One interesting note, both Craterhoof Behemoth and Gristlebrand are from the same set, making Avacyn Restored a pretty impressive set when it comes to 8 mana cards. Anyway, Gristlebrand is simply one of the best creatures in the game. Not only does he let you pay life to draw cards, he can also gain you life thanks to lifelink, and then let you draw even more cards. It's hard to beat Gristlebrand in most cases, even if he's killed right away, because of the card advantage he generates. But Gristlebrand's mana cost, including quadruple black, can be challenging, and of course that means nobody ever actually pays that. Just casting Gristlebrand isn't really an option, but as we've discussed on this list, there are lots of ways to cheap expensive, powerful creatures into play. It gained a few points in Standard, where it was reanimated with Unburial Rites, and a few points in Modern, where it's usually reanimated with Goryo's Vengeance. The Eternal formats are where it's easiest to cheat into play, though, with lots of methods we've already talked about, including Show and Tell, Sneak Attack, and Oath of Druids. It's going to keep on gaining points going forward, but that's also likely for the cards in front of it. At number 2, it is Ugin, the Spirit Dragon. Like Gristlebrand, it managed to hold on to its spot on the list by being very active over the last 4 years. in this case gaining 40 points. Of all the cards on the list, this is the one that is the most frequently actually cast for 8 mana, as Ugin is usually ramped into instead of cheated into play. If you can get your mana going early, he is an absurd payoff. He has a +2 that lets you do 3 to anything, a -X which can wipe the board of things that aren't Ugin, and an ultimate that gains you 7 life, draws you 7 cards, and then puts 7 permanents onto the battlefield. Ugin has been played mostly in various ramp decks in Standard, Historic, Pioneer, and Modern. He saw a ton of play in Standard, especially in his more recent reprint, and his big score is partly the result of being printed in that Standard legal set. The first time around, he was played in Devotion to Green in various control decks, but not quite as heavily as he was played the second time around in Standard, where he showed up alongside Omnath, Locus of Creation, which he also did in Historic. In Pioneer, it was played in Lotus Field decks, and in Modern, he's played in Tron. All of these decks can get Ugin into play early, and that's tough to beat. Ugin will keep gaining points, but it has a ways to go if it's ever going to be number 1 on this list, and it doesn't look very likely that that will happen. And at number 1, I have both Dig Through Time and Treasure Cruise, who were also number 1 last time. I included these two together then and now because they would have been the number 1 and number 2 on the list. They were released around the same time, they have similar effects, and they've even been played in the same decks. Both of these are hugely powerful card draw spells that come with Delve, which allows you to exile cards from your graveyard to decrease their cost. Decks that use them can often cast Dig for 2 and Treasure Cruise for 1, which is pretty great because both grant a massive advantage. Dig Through Time gives you the 2 best cards from your top 7, and Treasure Cruise draws you 3 cards. While both of these cards were relatively fair in Standard, it was too easy to load the graveyard for them in all the other formats. Dig Through Time and Treasure Cruise have been banned in both Modern and Legacy, and they're restricted in Vintage. Despite having their scores suppressed by those bannings and restrictions, they still have very impressive scores. They are both fully legal in Pioneer, where they have seen some play in graveyard-oriented blue decks. Despite being restricted in Vintage, they both still see a ton of play there, as both are included in most blue decks in the format. These are consistently putting up a ton of points, and that makes it hard for any other 8-mana card to ever catch them. Ugin even had the major bonus of being reprinted in a Standard legal set since the 2018 list, and still couldn't quite keep up. So those are the 10 cards that cost 8 mana that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. If you want to own any of these 8 mana cards, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each of them. If you want to catch up on past MTG top 10s, including many more that look at mana values, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. If you want to make sure to catch future videos, including more MTG top 10s and a whole lot of other Magic content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Thanks for watching.